In Exodus chapter 16, we learn that God's people were on the move in the wilderness. Yeah, the wilderness. And although they're no longer slaves in Egypt, they weren't exactly secure in the promised land either. The wilderness had its benefits, but it also had its setbacks. And let me tell you, God's people were super fixated on the setbacks. Imagine that. It had been 2 months since they had left Egypt, and they were beginning to wonder if this whole deliverance experiment had gone terribly wrong. Why did we leave? Why did we leave the posh flats in Egypt with all the gyros and pitas we could eat? We're starving to death out here, all of us. Now, you can imagine with that kind of attitude, these wanderers were in desperate need of what we're calling Wilderness School 101. But God, who is always God the provider, responded to Moses saying, bread is what they want, bread is what they're going to get. And I'm going to make it rain, bread from heaven, every single day. Every single person, every family, every individual, every man, woman, and child are going to get enough. And oh, by the way, have them collect double on the 6th day of each week. Because I don't work on the 7th day. It's the Sabbath day of rest. So there was Moses, the leader who had led these people out of the oppression of Egypt and witnessed all of God's frustration. All God wanted was trust, for God's people to trust God. And Moses desperately wanted the people to get it, to fully live into the message of God's provision. So Moses delivered God's message to the people. Yep, God's heard your whining and complaining. You're going to get what you need. Maybe not exactly what you want, but what you need. Bread and meat too. And it will appear every single day. But don't gather too much and don't gather too little. Because there's a method to God's massive, mad provision. It's a day-to-day delivery system. So lesson number 1, in the wilderness school, we trust and God provides. We trust and God provides. The next day, the bread came from heaven. It showed up, but it was kind of odd. It was light and flaky, rumored to taste like honey and nuts. Now, if that isn't baklava from heaven, I don't know what is. But God's people were confused, didn't know what to make of it. So they called it manna, which in Hebrew means, what is it? And true to form, God provided the what is it bread every single morning, save Sabbath Saturdays. Why? Because God wanted God's people to trust that God is provider. Now, that's a great story, Pastor Rachel. We trust God provides. What else you got? Because I'm really broke and I need so much more. Well, hang with me, friend. Because if we don't get this, understand it, comprehend it, embrace it as our own, we'll always be broke because our understanding of God and money, or should I say manna, will always be messed up. It's easy to say that God provides when the bills have been paid, our bellies are full, we've got money in the bank, and ability to be generous out of our extra. But what happens? What happens when the medical bills are piling up and we've been unable to pay the water bill for 3 months? Or you're behind on your credit card payment and the interest rate just jumped 6%, or you thought you could handle that cash advance, but what was supposed to yield you $100 and a week of just breathing room has now snowballed into $3,500 in debt. It's that 30-year student loan payment, the job loss, the unemployment check that didn't come when promised. It's all of that leaves you with anxiety. Question, does God really provide? I mean, does God actually care? Where is God in the middle of my mess? Desperation is at the core of broke. We've not only lost our financial security, but we've lost our intimate dependence on God. We're broke in every sense of the word. And I get it. I confess that I've resorted to praying that 11th hour prayer for God to bail me out of the broke situation I find myself in. Maybe those are manipulative prayers. Or maybe those are prayers of desperation. Whatever they are, I believe that God hears those prayers. God could have ignored the whiners and the wilderness, but God didn't, and God doesn't. God had a bigger, a kinder picture in mind, a future plan for all of God's people. God actually wanted to gift an example to the entire universe of what it meant to live in deep, genuine love with God and with other people, to live generous lives. And generosity, what it requires, trust. We trust and God provides. But trust, it isn't instant. Trust isn't magic. It isn't a genie in a bottle. Trust is learned through not so pleasant experiences. That's why the people are in the wilderness. That's why they're wandering around trying to get this thing figured out. They've been exposed to the ways and rituals of Egypt for 400 years. And although God successfully delivered them out of Egypt, the people weren't ready to let Egypt go. Getting the people out of Egypt was easy. Getting the Egypt out of the people, what they knew, what they were used to, what was familiarly painful and yet predictable, that was hard. That had to be prayerfully and intentionally dismantled. Order, disorder, and reorder in order into a brand new belief system. We trust, and God provides. Back to our relationship with money. Let's drill down into our minds and hearts a little bit. What's in here? I bet we're going to find that we have a little bit of Egypt inside of all of us as well. God has successfully delivered us out of a mess plenty of times, and yet we aren't ready to let the relative security of our own stuff go, even if that stuff is uncomfortable. And now, getting out of this familiar way of life, our painful yet predictable brokenness still needs to be prayerfully and intentionally dismantled. An Egypt mindset is a scarcity mindset. There isn't enough, there'll never be enough. But a promised land mindset, that promised land mindset is we trust and God provides. So what does that trust even look like? Trust looks like George Mueller. George Mueller intentionally decided to move to Bristol, England in the mid-1800s. He saw a need, many children with no resources. Much like our Ginghamsburg community, he too believed that no kid within his reach should go to bed without faith, family, or food. He and his wife began by making their own rented home into an orphanage for 30 girls, and then they acquired 3 more houses, this time for boys too, and younger children, and then schools for children. And then soon Mueller was in need of quite a lot of money. And Mueller's heart was not a hustling heart. He had poured his life into these kids to help them live full lives. He didn't want to be a fundraiser. So he started a multi-million-dollar successful campaign. No, just kidding. He didn't do that at all. Mueller instead chose to trust. Trust was his strategy. He chose to believe that if he put his full trust in God, that God would actually provide. And so he did it. Seriously, trust. Every single day, he needed the basics like bread for the kids to eat, and every day Mueller would pray for daily bread. And that daily bread would come every single stinking day. I'm sure there were days that bread came later than sooner, but Mueller actually trusted and God provided. He wrote, I live in the spirit of prayer. I pray as I walk about, when I lie down and when I rise up, and the answers are always coming. Friends, can you imagine? I mean, being so intimately connected and dependent on God that you had the boldness to ask God for daily bread. And I'm not talking about just a little bit of bread here. Over the course of his lifetime, Mueller and his wife cared for 10,000 orphans, established 117 schools, offered Christian education to over 120,000 kids. And some people were so angry with Mueller that, I quote, he raised the poor above their natural station in British life. They're so angry with him that they wanted to get rid of him. I mean, Mueller was messing with Pharaoh's Egypt, and the people in power didn't like it. He was letting go of Pharaoh's Egypt because he had the courage to actually live in the promised land. He trusted the God of the universe for daily bread, and God provided. We trust, and God provides. Now, friends, how do you and I get to that place? That place of trust. How do we access our ability to live into and fully participate in God's generosity? Well, here's where it gets super practical. If you've experienced any financial brokenness, a Mueller kind of trust may feel like a bungee jump into the financial abyss. First, we got to kind of get honest with God and ourselves and name our circumstances. We call that a budget. And this week, Pastor Rusty sat down with Ivy Glover, community development specialist and financial counselor at Right Pat Credit Union. And they chatted and gifted us with simple and yet effective insights on what it means to make a budget.
Today, we want to zoom in on the B word, budgeting, right? It can be a little scary for us, but the budget is one of the fundamental pieces of getting our financial lives in order. So you're going to offer us a few tips in just a minute, but could you briefly define, what do you mean? What do we mean when we say the word budget?
The word budget.
Yeah.
So some people do call it the B word, right?
Yeah,
because
right.
it's a little bit scary. But ultimately, a budget is a plan on how we're going to navigate our money before we do it. And I think that's the key word with a budget, that we're supposed to be planning ahead for how we're going to spend our money. Life happens, things change, but at least sets parameters, what I like to say, goals and boundaries for what we're going to do with our money. And it gives us some guidelines that we can follow to help us navigate along the way.
Yeah, that's really good, because when you can take something that feels like it's all over the place, you can put some boundaries on it, put it in a box. Hey, now we can talk about this and manage it. That's really great. It's helpful. Talk about some of the tips you have for us. If we're just getting started, or we've tried a budget and it just hasn't worked out, motivate us today a little bit in the direction of a budget.
Sure. Well, if I could motivate anyone today around a budget, is to know that even though you put it in a box, it's an ever-going, lifelong thing. I think that's the good and bad news of a budget. So be patient with yourself when it comes to budgeting, because you're going to always be doing it.
Good.
But a couple of tips that I could offer, one would be, before you ever put pen to paper or put pen back on paper, is to really take a pause and think about your why when it comes to your finances and when it comes to your life. What's most important to you? How we behave with our money is usually a reflection of a couple of things: our experiences, our knowledge, and what's important to us. And it's funny, because knowledge, even though 1 + 1 = 2 is what we're taught so much in school, it's usually got the least impact on how we behave with our money. It's the habits, it's the experiences. So really taking a pause on your why is the first step to determining how I'm going to navigate my money and how I'm going to do it in a way that works for me and my household and my family. So I would recommend, literally, what's your why? Think about it, write it down. My why is, I want to expose my sons, I have 5 of them, to life and legacy. My husband and I want to be able to provide a life that exposes them to life beyond these walls. We're born and raised in this area, but we want to travel, education, arts, and giving. Those are all huge to us, and they all cost money. And so that's what keeps me focused when I need to make improvements to how I handle my finances, and that's what also keeps me focused in looking ahead to what's to come. Yep. So that's the first step. The second step would be to, before you ever again go into this monthly document, to track your spending.
Okay.
We have to set the GPS with the right address, right? We have to know where we're starting to know where we're heading.
Yep.
Write every expense down that you have, whether it's a vending machine or paying your mortgage or your rent. Write it down on one list where you can take a look at it and then make decisions on, are there any things I can eliminate? Are there any things that I can reduce? Is there something that I'm missing that needs to be added?
Yeah.
When you see it in front of you, it gives you a nice launch point to actually create a budget that works. How many of us have written a budget down based on what we think sounds right, but there are things missing? There are things that, because, again, experience says, I don't want to add that in there. There are habits that say, but if we write it down, we can see it. And then I think the third thing would be, because a lot of people always ask me, well, once you do go into a budgeting tool, what do you use? You have to use the tool that works for you. Some people like pen and paper. Some people like digital. And there are apps out there. I don't know if I can name specific ones or not.
You can name some apps. Yeah,
some of the apps I like, everydollar.com, which is Dave Ramsey has a website and an app-based tool. YNAB, You Need a Budget. That's another budgeting tool that's nice. But also check with your financial institutions. For example, if you're a member of Right Pat, we actually have within our online banking system a money management piece to it that pulls your transactions. You can pull in other accounts that are not Right Pat Credit Union, and it creates budgets. It creates cash flow trends and everything for you right in the system. So you can look at those. I personally am back to pen and paper.
Okay.
There is something about going through the process, 15 minutes a week, of writing down, having a conversation, reviewing my numbers and updating them, myself and my husband, that kind of helps keep us on track. And we just had to get back to the basics. And I think that that's okay too. So you use the tool that works for you, and you anticipate within that budget not only what's happening for your current month, but what's coming in the next 2 to 3 months, right? Because everything's not each month. You had mentioned earlier, not all months are created equal. I
Right.
think that's
Sometimes
a great
this-
way to say it.
Yeah, this big bill's due then.
Yeah.
There's this month, the income's different or the expenses are different.
Exactly. You have some people pay quarterly taxes,
Right.
or we have a quarterly trash bill. Some
Yep.
people have quarterly water bills. So you want to anticipate those things and plan for them monthly, even though they may not be happening monthly.
Yeah.
And so those are a couple tips that I would offer.
Thank you, Ivy and Rusty. You've got me thinking about some of the extras that I need to write down on paper, getting honest with myself and with God. But friends, we can't stop there. Naming our circumstances is just one part of our prayer toward trust. Asking is the next step. Moses asked God. George Mueller asked God. And we've got to be daily asking God as well. Day by day, moment by moment, surrendering our lives, our resources, our debt, our worry, and yes, even our budgets over to the big guy upstairs. It's actually a very freeing practice, one that will set our hearts free, especially in this season of change. So let's do just that. I want to invite you to join me today in a symbol of our trust that I hope will become a habit of dependence. Let's hold our hands out in front of us as a sign of our surrender. God, we come from many different circumstances today. Financial woes and worries that seem beyond our scope and ability. We've been introduced to an entirely new set of 2020 circumstances, and it's time we name our situation and ask for what we need. It's time for us to trust you. When there's a whole lot of month at the end of the money, God, we trust you. God, we trust that you're going to help us get our financial houses in order. We trust that at the end of the day, we have what we need, though not necessarily what we want. Today, we are committing ourselves to this first class of your wilderness school. We trust you to provide. We pray this and we claim this in the powerful name of Jesus Christ. Amen.